So why don't you go ahead and get started, John?
Okay.
I think that'll be fine. I would give you an introduction, but everybody knows who you are. And I'd probably go off into nostalgia and talk about what when we first met 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, rather than and that's not
I've got
particularly
stories about
relevant.
you too, so I could reciprocate. I've got an hour to talk about you. Look, thanks Herb and team for inviting me. I wished and only wished that I could actually
were
physically.
embarrassing stories.
Say again?
These weren't embarrassing stories.
No. Look, I only wished I could be there in Sydney, not only because I get to have more time with Herb and the team, I meet my two granddaughters up there, but not to be at this moment, and it's not because of Victoria. And what the topic that I'm going to talk about today is issues relating to visible learning. I published it now 11 years ago, and the world has changed a lot in that 11 years. And the publishers have been at me to write a second edition, but I've resisted for lots of reasons. But I am working on what I'm calling the sequel. And I wanted to raise 5 points that I hope will generate some discussion. These are the 5 points that is going to dominate the sequel, as opposed to the first one, which was more about the data, and I'll come back to that. So let's look about updating the meta-analyses. Since 2009, where there were 800 meta-analyses, now I'm up to 1,700. And you know how it works. Researchers don't stop. They keep adding. And so I keep adding to the database, and you can see it's about 250 million students. The fundamental distribution has not changed. And certainly when I started, I didn't expect it like this. I expected a lot more in the red zone. Everyone out there says schools aren't doing a good job, blah, blah, blah. And so you'd expect more down there. And there's not much down there. And quite a few of the things in the red zone are perfectly sensible, like the effect size of bullying, minus 0.3, the effect size of boredom, minus 0.5. And when you take those obvious ones into account, 95 to 98% of things that we do to kids enhances their achievement. And that's probably the first big message that I looked at in 2009. We've got to stop saying we can improve kids' achievement, because everybody can virtually. I wanted to up the ante and get away from what works and argue what works best. And why it took me 20 years to write the book was trying to understand the common factors, to use Herb's words, underlying the influences in that blue zone above the average, discriminated from those influences below the average in the yellow zone. And trying to pick that story is the hard part. Interestingly, when I move aside from visible learning and ask the question, what's the average effect size increase from one year to the next? And I used NAPLAN data, SATs from England, No Child Left Behind from the US, EASTL, PISA, TIMSS. And in every one of those cases, in every subject, in every year, the answer is exactly the same to the second decimal point, 0.40. Now that's on average. We know the floor of the average. And so what that means is those teachers and schools that are in that blue zone, their kids are gaining more than a year's growth for a year's input. And surely that's impressive. So I think we've got a really good understanding of what good quality teaching, learning in schools looks like compared to those that are not up to the average effect. And the other side of it is when you look at that distribution, it translates to roughly, in Australia, around 65 to 75% of schools and teachers are already in that blue zone. The visible learning story is this simple. Have we got the courage to identify those teachers and schools where their kids gain more than a year's growth for a year's input, form a coalition of success around them, and then invite those in the yellow zone to join? And I have to say the biggest problem in education is the lack of courage. It is so much easier to not have difficult conversations and worry about a lot of that stuff, as we're going to see in the yellow zone. Our conversations are obsessed with debates in the yellow zone. Not that they're unimportant, but relative to what is, they're much less important. So that's the big message, and that hasn't changed in 10 years. The details have changed. one of the issues with meta-analysis over the last almost 50 years now, since Gene Glass invented it in 1976. I don't know, Herb, which conference we actually met at, but that was my first AERA conference as a graduate student in San Francisco, and there was a sense in the room that something happened that day. And he introduced a very simple notion where you look at the magnitude, which is the effect size, how big is the effect, and then you ask, are there moderators? Now, many of the critics of meta-analysis have forgotten the second part. And I'd have to say also that if you look over the years, the quality of the moderators has hardly improved. We still look for the easy to get stuff, the age of the kid, whether it's a male or a female, whether those kind of things, as opposed to some of the deeper, more interesting ones. And that, I think, is a reasonable criticism of meta-analysis. Of course, there are incredible major exceptions to that. But we've dramatically improved the sophistication of the methodology with Hedges' work, with the heterogeneity work, the random, the mixed, and all these kind of things. And I'm with Gene Glass on this. I don't think they've added much at all. Yes, they've added a rigor, but sometimes that rigor hides what needs to happen. And in fact, I reviewed a meta-analysis very recently for a journal, and I said, it's just a summary of data. There's no thinking in here. There's no interpretation. Similarly, as many of you know, there's a whole debate about method and whether randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. I don't believe they're the gold standard for a second. I take the line that the gold standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, and there are certainly some lousy RCTs out there and some good ones. As an aside, one of our arguments is that visible learning pertains mainly to well-resourced countries. We've just finished, in the final process of finishing, a book on 7,000 randomized controlled trials in Global South, not well-resourced countries, because I was always been intrigued as how is it different in those countries, and it is. They invest more in the yellow zone than we do. And the fundamental argument, which is not new to us, but certainly we're exploring it, is they invest in schooling, they don't invest in learning. But that's another story. But the interpretations, it's still the art of any research design. It's how you look at what the conclusions and discussions are and do they add. And as I said, looking at that depth of moderators, and I want to come back to that. What I've been doing is a meta-analysis of meta-analyses, and now 10 years later, there's quite a few of them out there. Medicine have picked up on it. They've got a new term for them. They call them umbrella analyses. Not my favorite term. I prefer to call them meta-syntheses or meta-analyses of meta-analysis. That's what they are. And there are some recent work looking at how we can improve the quality of the methodology there. As I'm sure if you know, if you work in the centre there at ACU, there are now so many more ways of doing it. I was working with a student actually from George Mason University who's developed an R program, and I put in a topic. It immediately does all the searching. It creates an Excel spreadsheet with all the data file, with all the articles, the links and all that stuff. And there are so many more things we do. It's quite sophisticated to do that. But my bottom line is this. It's a very simple notion about moderators and averages. And that interpretation is what matters. So what are the criticisms of my work? Well, there are many. And a couple of years ago, we found 100 different criticisms out there. We wrote a paper, a gold paper we called it, which is free up on the web if anyone wants to look at, looking at all the criticisms. And what intrigued us is 2/3 of them were based on the league table. That table I produced in Visible Learning of the rankings of all the influences. And close to 90% of the criticisms about the league table clearly indicate they never opened the book. Like an absurd one. There's a whole article written about how could he possibly look at the difference between boys and girls, because it depends which direction you put boys and girls in the equation. Well, if they'd opened the book, they would have seen that I converted them all to one direction. But nope, they ignored that. And so many, like the other one, you can't look at these rankings as if they're separate. Well, as I say in the preface, it took me 20 years to see the overlap. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some criticisms that have gone to heart, and part of the sequel is looking at them. The misuse of the notion of 0.4, and I probably didn't help that in the early days. Some of the influences below 0.4 should worry the heck out of us that they're so low. And the message has never been ignore them. Like teacher subject matter knowledge has a very, very low effect size of about 0.09. That doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about it. That means we should worry about why it's so low. And we've spent probably 10, 15 years of work trying to understand why it's so low. I think we're getting to an answer. Similarly with the one that everyone raises, it's their pet subject. And because it didn't go in the blue zone, they hate my work, class size. And the evidence is very systematic that the average effective class size is small, 0.2, 0.15 to 0.2. And that hasn't changed in 50 years. And the question is, why is such an obvious, powerful influence so small? That's the right research question. And a lot of people have been working on that, particularly Peter Blanchford, and I think we've come to a much more sophisticated understanding. It's still a low effect size, but I think we know why, and I think that's one of the beauties. And quite frankly, I didn't help by initially casting anything lower than 0.4 as unimportant. That should never have been the message. Last year, we said, okay, one of the fascinations when you look across the 100 different criticisms, no one has come up with a different explanation about what the message is underlying the data. So I said to the team, why don't we challenge people? So we released a free website, MetaX, which has got all the data on it. And I'm in the process this week actually of updating it as I add new meta-analyses. So you don't have to spend 20 or 30 years collecting the data. There it is, all free, it's all yours. And I really challenge anyone to take any parts of it and reinterpret it. And this is where I'm excited about some of the meta-synthesis of studies in other areas where they are coming up with better explanations about what's going on. I think it also helps in terms of, as I said, looking at the moderators and the variance when you have a larger data set of 1/3 of a billion kids. I'm just going to mention a few of the new influences. I'm not going to explore these in great detail, but just to give you, I just want to mention a few, like all that mindfulness and growth mindset and grit. Yeah, they're there, but they're very small. And I've talked at great length with my good friend Carol Dweck on this, and she's as frustrated as I am, perhaps more frustrated than I am, about the gross and total misinterpretation of her work. She was the first to have a program to improve growth mindset. She called it Brainology. She said, within a year, I killed it because kids were getting better at all that growth mindset language. But when they went back to the class, they were still, oh, I can't do this. I can't do maths. I can't do music. I can't do phys ed. And she said, it has to be done in context. And she spent a lot of time and she's about to produce a new book showing how it can be done in context. No wonder it's tiny. People run it and they forget the notion of transfer. The home, in fact, my son and I have just finished another book on visible learning for parents. And we've taken all the home, we've added a whole new meta-analysis on parenting across many different dimensions. And our argument there is parents are not first teachers, they're first learners. Kids pick up a lot of cues from their parents about what to do when failure happens, mistakes happen. And looking at the notion of parent expectations, which is double the size of teacher expectations and half the size of student expectations. Structures of schooling, which is our dominant debate in Australia, religious, government, private schooling, all the ways we set up different kinds of schooling. Yeah, tiny. And class effects and retention is still massively negative, despite Herb Marsh. Herb has found, as you know, some positive effects, and this is a really good example of the average. If Herb's find positive effects, someone else has found markedly negative effects, because that's what an average of minus 0.32 is. And it's how you get underneath that to work out what's going on in retention. And there are not enough studies about the mechanics of retention. Like the fundamental reason that people are retained is because teachers believe that if they had the kid for more time, they could fix them. And my argument back to them is, well, you had them for a year and you failed. What the kid doesn't need is more of the same kind. What they need is different. And at the moment, typically the only difference is social promotion. As Jeff Masters has argued for a long time, putting kids in curriculum and year-based notions just is bonkers and doesn't help here. And in some countries in the world, you probably know, they don't have a year-based curriculum, they have a levels-based curriculum, and that helps reduce the problem a lot. But that's a really interesting one. Happy to follow that up. Who the teacher is, not much, but those teacher effects, teacher expectations, not labeling kids, teacher collective efficacy, very powerful, and that's going to come back to my big message in a moment. And some of the curriculum work, and notice on the curriculum side, it's not programs. I have a lot of program staff, which is very tiny. It's specific intervention programs. And that probably leads on to the big picture story of learning. I don't think we spend enough time on learning. We spend far too much on teaching. And I take the very strong line, I don't care less how anyone teaches anymore. I think it's a rabbit hole that we've gone down that hasn't helped us. I don't care how you teach. I care about the impact of your teaching on the learning of kids. And I want to come back to that too as one of my focus. I'm going to also comment, we've done some work looking at the whole social and emotional side of things. And given COVID, as you know, that's the big discussion at the moment. And it bothers me because it implies that we're going to have to now make teachers school counsellors. And the question I ask is, what aspects of social and emotional learning should teachers be responsible for, and what aspects should the professionals? And I asked about 15 different gurus in social and emotional learning around the world their answer to the question, and sadly they all answered it no. Teachers should be responsible for everything. Well, should they? If you look at all the social and emotional, you get quite a different distribution, not surprisingly, than you do when you look at the achievement effects. It's right across the distribution. And when you bring it together, that whole notion of building confidence, and if you look down that list, you can see Herb Marsh going down. Very strong effects of building confidence to take a task. And if you think of something like grit and growth mindsets, I think they are proxies for building kids' confidence. When you give the kid a task, do they have that sense of confidence that they can actually do it, that they can actually reach the success criteria? And if you're like most of us, if I'm given a task where it's going to be impossible for me to reach it in the time and resources I have, why would I bother? But the other side of it, if you look at Graham Nuttall's work, is the opposite. What he found is 40% taught in every class, all the kids know already. The problem in too many classes is the work isn't challenging. It's just doing. And there's no sense of challenge and confidence. Motivation, well, you have the gurus in the world and that. The one that I think is the most fascinating is when kids know when to be surface, give the facts, the content, and when to be deep. That strategic motivation, I think, is very powerful. And then this notion of engagement. One of Amy Berry and my team asked teachers what they meant by engagement, and the dominant concept of engagement was kids were doing. They were doing the task. And sadly, once again, in a lot of doing, there can be very little learning and very little challenge. And this is why I would argue that so many kids by the end of primary school have turned off this place called school, because it's just a place you go and do. And so that notion of challenge, which I think underlies self-efficacy and many of those other things, I think is something that we need to look at much more seriously to make a difference. These are the 7 big messages. Teachers working together, evaluating their impact, which begs the question of what we mean by impact. It begs this notion of what we mean by evaluation, and I'll come back to those. That notion of impact is mirrored very much in teacher expectations. Christine Ruby's work showing that teachers who have high expectations tend to have it for all the students and are successful, and teachers who have low expectations have it for all the students and also, sadly, are successful. So understanding those expectations teachers have about progress, about success, about challenge is pretty critical. And as Christine has shown, that if you go into the classes of teachers with high and low expectations, you fundamentally see different behaviours by the kids and the teachers. And then when you communicate those expectations to kids, which is why we're so obsessed with success criteria, And when Shirley Clark and I, a couple of years ago, were doing the work for our feedback book, we went to these classes that had stunningly good success criteria. The teachers were so impressive. But we interviewed the students about what they meant by the success criteria. And sadly, in so many cases, it was interpreted about the facts, the surface knowledge, the content. Good students were like Siri, they knew lots. And the conspiracy is kids above average prefer facts because that's the game they're good at. They prefer teachers to talk more because that's the game they understand. It's the kids below average want the teachers to shut up and listen to how they're thinking and processing and what they know and what they don't know, which is what we saw in COVID teaching, where teachers were forced to shift from talking to triage. And if you do have challenge in your success criteria, there's a gap between what the kid knows when they walk into the room and where you want them to be. So that Goldilocks principle of making sure that that success criteria is not too hard, not too easy, and not too boring. And of course, then kids don't know. What's the point of going to school if you already know the stuff? And so how do you make errors and failure part of the everyday life of a classroom? And if you ask kids, for example, as we do in our work, what do you do when you don't know? They nearly all say, I put my hand up and ask the teacher. Watch them. No, they don't. The only kids who put their hands up are the kids who know or think they know. Other kids by age 8 have learned how to look invisible in the classroom as if they know things going on. And that's a disaster for learning. So how do we make errors and failure normal, successful, and the word struggle in learning the most positive phrase in the classroom? And how do you then maximize the feedback back to the teacher about their impact, which goes directly to where you and your team, Herb, are going at the moment in the student evaluations, which I'll come back to. And that relentless focus on learning. So that's the big message. What we've been doing over the 10 years, besides visible learning, is we've gone out and invested in a program to how do we implement it in schools. And we've implemented it now in around about 10 to 15,000 schools around the world. We've got all the data on that. Last year, we spent a whole year in COVID looking at the decade of impact, looking at the evaluation. So I've learned a lot also about what we do in classrooms. And one of the hardest things to do in classrooms is to get teachers to see it's about how they think more than what they do. You could take one program, reciprocal teaching, for example. One teacher implements it well, one teacher doesn't. What's that key ingredient? And if you look down that 7, there's not a curriculum there, there's hardly a kid there, there's not an age there, there's not a country there. What dominates is teacher expertise. And I would argue we have plenty of it. Here's a question. In the year 1900, when you ask how many people in the world were literate and numerate, the answer is 14%. In the year 2000, it's 86%. If you sat down and wrote the history of the 20th century, surely that is the most phenomenal occurrence, beats the Renaissance, beats the Grecian times, going from 14 to 86% in one century. And my question is why? I hope you're thinking of some answers here. And having done this many, many times now, I get answers like communication, the distribution of textbooks, the advent of schooling, and they're all the wrong answer. There is only one answer. Because of teachers. And the reason I use this example is teachers of any profession are the biggest deniers of their expertise. Whereas the kids did the work. They're very generous. It was the resources they had. It was the parents who helped. No. How often do we get teachers standing up and attributing success to what they did? And if you look at that big 7, it is about their expertise. Take COVID. Typically what happens in schools is policies come down from up top. I don't know a single policy throughout the world that has helped a teacher in COVID teaching to better do their job other than whether a school should open and close. But if you look what happened in the last year, we saw a dramatic change from regular classrooms to distance learning, back to regular classrooms, to hybrid, whatever. It all came from the teachers and the school leaders. Last year was the biggest education-led revolution that we've ever seen. And what worries me now, particularly in my political role, is how quickly we're forgetting it and going back to the old hierarchy. That expertise is phenomenal, and we don't tap it because of a teacher. And when you look at some of the work coming out, Class Zara has just produced a paper looking at meta-analysis across 12 different studies, 5 million people. The overall effect size, it's negative, but it's pretty small. It's certainly not this massive learning loss. And when we look at the work we're doing, the majority of kids did better last year. But those who didn't do so well, some of them did quite badly. So it's quite a mixed message in there. I look at the New Zealand study that looked at what happened last year compared to the previous 10 years. They slightly went down in reading, they slightly went up in maths, anything with writing they went down appreciably. And I think there's good reason to explain what happened here. So every time you hear the word about learning loss and COVID, I want you to say, why are they so insulting the expertise of teachers who dramatically minimize the massive disruptions to the point where I would argue within a couple of months you could return that minus to a positive? And there are so many good things that we can learn from last year. Notwithstanding, there were some pretty bad things as well. And there was some learning loss and there are equity issues. But overall, trying to learn what happened last year because of teachers. That expertise is very powerful. And I get into a lot of trouble with it because people argue that I'm blaming the teachers. It's about the resources. It's about the curriculum. No. Now, what I want to do is understand that impact of teachers. And that's why we look at the mind frames. Now, I'm going to jump past that, Chrissy. When I look at the mind frames, the argument is, what is that underlying thinking? And we've got teacher and student ones. As I mentioned, my son and I are just producing the parent mind frames, and we're looking at the student mind frames at the moment. And if you look through those, we're trying to get at the nature of the thinking underlying that impact of teachers. Now, in each case, there are 10 of them. I learned again from Carol Dweck. I said to her one day, one of the problems of your work, Karen, is you have one, growth versus fixed. And so I have 10. I've actually got one repeated 10 times. When a teacher walks into a classroom, when a school leader walks into a staff room, and they say, my job here today is to evaluate my impact, the kids are the beneficiaries. And the other 9 are kind of variants of that. And so, yes, we've written books on each of these. We could explore these. But I want to go a step further. This notion of evaluative thinking is what we're looking at as the key underlying those mind frames. It's teachers who are critical thinkers about the evidence in front of them, the evidence of artifacts of kids' work, the evidence of test scores, the evidence of student voice, how they actually then make their interpretations. And then how collectively they are prepared to have those interpretations critiqued. And that's where really excellent schools make a difference. How they're willing to look at unintended consequences and the fidelity of their implementation with each and every one of their students. And one of the killers in our business is adaptations. Sometimes teachers make adaptations to programs to fit their prior thinking of what should happen, which is not the reason for an intervention, is to give them alternative ways of thinking. And the potential biases that can happen. We all have our biases. That's the nature of psychology. But to what degree? Like I'm very good at confirmation bias when I teach. I look for evidence I'm doing a good job. It's not a very scientific way of doing it. In fact, I should be looking for evidence I'm not doing a good job and fixing it. And this notion about understanding what impact means, it's not passing test scores. It's not covering the curriculum. It's understanding what that progress through to achievement means. And the number 5 is the hardest. How do you stand in other people's shoes? Like, I'm not a fan of all that reflective teaching nonsense because 80% of what happens in a classroom a teacher doesn't see or hear. How do you listen to your colleagues' interpretation of what's happening in your classroom in terms of its impact? and the student's viewpoint. Last year, we published a book arguing that the essence of the profession of the teacher is evaluative thinking. And so that's what we're working on at the moment. We're also spending a lot of time, like Alison Jones made the best criticism of visible learning I've ever heard right back at the beginning. And she was at a seminar in Auckland, and good colleague, good friend, quite a different perspective on the world than I have. And she came up, tongue in cheek, but very serious. And she said, "John, I'm impressed. I'm so impressed that you know about the details of what happens in classrooms to the second decimal point." The work doesn't get well inside classrooms. I spent 2 or 3 years trying to do a meta-synthesis of classroom observation studies, but the effects size concept was all out the window. So we've spent a lot of time in the last 10 years checking out our theories in classrooms. We've built a classroom here at Melbourne where it looks like an ordinary classroom, but actually it's wired up so we don't have to wire the kids, and it's videoed up so we don't have, kid doesn't see a video. We can track really incredibly what happens in lessons. Behind the one-way mirror, we can do other things. We can do emotions, we can do eye gazing, we can do wops on people's heads. And so wonderful classroom, usual problem, far too much data, but it's an exciting problem to have. And we've done a lot of work looking at what happens with kids in this. I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment. We also, in terms of the eye gaze, we used eye gaze to try and see if we could actually detect physically how kids went about their thinking. Let me illustrate. We gave the kids, with a camera on them, these 3 words out of Mednick's remote associates test out of the 1960s, and they had to work out what's the one word that's common to those 3. So can you work that out? If you had to come up with one word that fits with those 3. So what happens? We monitor the kid, and you can see there's the moment where they discovered bowl. It's dramatically obvious when kids make connections. I'm sure you've seen some people who do it with their hands, that when people move their hands like that, they're trying to make connections. If you ask them a pub quiz and or a factual question, they don't move their hands. Now, someone wrote an article that thinking could be seen above the elbows. Now, this is a bit simplistic, but the point is, I think it's fascinating that, as far as I can see, no one's ever asked, how can you help teachers move kids from the content to relating and transferring the ideas? Now, I'm not sure there's an exact moment, but this is the kind of stuff that we've really enjoyed looking at in terms of the whole science of learning. We've also developed, and Janet has developed, an app, Visible Classrooms, and teacher turns their phone on, the app on it's on their iPhone or their Android. They put it in their pockets, they teach the lesson. At the end, they turn it off. Immediately, they get a transcript of what they said. That's 98% plus accurate. And they get about 16 codes from the Danielson and Mazzano, and we're building more artificial intelligence to do this. It's the free version that's on the Apple Store is kind of limited, but it's okay. And we've now done 15, 16,000 lessons to try and get what happens in classrooms. We know that kids talk, primary kids talk 124 words a minute, secondary kids 140, teachers 174. Academics probably faster. They speak 1.5 grade levels above the kids. They talk. 89% of the lesson is teacher talk. Remember the conspiracy. The kids above average want teachers to talk more. Academics talk 100%. They ask 142 questions that require less than 3-word answers from the kids, and students on average, a class, ask 11, of which 9 to 10 are process ones. What page am I on? Can I go to the toilet? That's the typical classroom. Now, we know that teacher percentage of time talking is not good enough. It depends how they talk and what they talk about. But it is an interesting scenario about what's out there still. We took those 17,000 and we said, we did a meta-synthesis of learning strategies. And as we were writing up, we thought, well, let's go read through them and find examples when teachers tried to understand what learning strategy the kid was using or give them an alternative strategy. After 4,000 classes, we found zero and gave up. Classes aren't about learning, they're about talking. So getting better understanding of within classrooms. And obviously what we're doing is that as we implement our visible learning program into schools, we're using these kinds of methods to help teachers see the change, see the nature of what's happening from the kids' point of view, and also seeing the change that they make as they go about the visible learning methodology. The last I want to briefly mention is, let me mention this, because this was my midnight last night in Germany. There's a new book coming out from the German team, and I was the discussant on that, and I also wrote the foreword to the book. And I think it's really exciting that we are looking at ways to help teachers see what happens through the eyes of students. And I particularly like their subtitle. It's about developing teachers, not evaluating. And this is why I'm really excited to be involved with your team on the work that you're doing, because I think there's a massive breakthrough to come through, is that how we can help teachers see learning through the eyes of the students. Interesting, during COVID, as part of our Verso work, we asked the kids about, after a lesson, are they confused or not? And you can see that this is across many thousands and thousands of kids here. About 67% in this sample we picked out were confused, 33% were not. But when the kids were able to articulate the purpose of the lesson, you can see quite a big transformation. And so when we talk about all this well-being stuff, which is too often personified as a kid issue, we're saying no, it's a teacher issue in terms of what they can do. And this is where teacher clarity, and this is some of the other stuff we're playing with in the whole learning side. I want to focus on learning and briefly mention that, because that's the big one. We did a meta-analysis looking at 400 different strategies, and there's a few little example there. We had a much smaller sample size than Achievement. We only had about 26 million kids in the sample size. And there was a lot of these strategies that didn't have a meta-analysis. So we actually did quite a few meta-analyses as part of this. The overall effect, 0.53, higher than the 0.4 in visible learning. But the variability, oh my gosh, it's dramatic. The same strategy works today, doesn't work tomorrow. And so that was the problem. And so we worked out a model to explain it. And our argument is that a kid walks into a class with various skills, working memory, prior achievement, certain wills, self-efficacy, growth mindset, all that 21st century stuff, and certain thrills, the motivations. And those are the three outcomes. But the strategies that work when a kid is first exposed to something, the surface acquiring, can be quite different to when they're asked to consolidate that so they can go on to relating ideas, deeper conceptual understanding, and then consolidate it. And we wanted to include transfer because that's our dirty secret. We've known from day one that transfer is critical, but can we actually teach it? Now, in a nutshell, sum it up, yes, we can identify the top strategies, but as you can see, it depends on when in the cycle. Whereabouts in the learning cycle. And it's really interesting when you look at, for instance, Bob Mazzano's work. He's got a book on 500 teaching strategies, and you line them up. 450 of them you throw out the window because they're all over the place. Teaching doesn't map to learning, and kids have to do incredible translations about what strategies to use depending on what the teacher asks them to do. And for many kids, that's a step too far. So where we are in this work at the moment, we're at the stage of mapping up the teaching methods. And it's interesting, there's only two methods that actually follow the learning model, the Padilla and the Jigsaw. You can see a few others there, but of those other 400 odd out the window. We call our model the Kenny Rogers model, and we've actually reinvented the song. You got to know when to hold them, you got to know when to play it. We're also developing an assessment tool where we're helping kids see how well they are on the strategies, and then depending on how well they are compared to peer groups, it gives them resources to use. We've also done that as a teacher one, where we're about to release that as a free website. We're not quite there, but it took us about 5 to 8 goes of doing item analysis and development to get to the final scale, but we are there. So that's the sequel. These are the kind of things that I've been playing with in the last 5 or 10 years. This is what I want to talk about, trying to get to the big story as opposed to all the detail. I hope I've given enough to have discussion, Herb.
All right, well, thank you very much. And it's a shame we couldn't do this live. It would have been so much better, but it's we're grateful that you were willing to do it through Teams. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks, John.
Thanks,
See
John.
everybody.